Yep. Double click it, yeah.
Oops. Okay. There we go. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Rydeen. I work for National Marine Fisheries Service out of the St. Petersburg office, and I am one of the two FDOT transportation liaisons that has a position that's funded through Federal Highways and Florida DOT. I basically cover the west coast of the state, and Brandon Howard's my counterpart. He does the east coast, so I get everything from Everglades City through Pensacola, and he gets everything from Key West up to Jacksonville. So I have districts 1, 3, and 7, and he has all the other ones. District 2 we split since that sort of goes across the state. And so I'm going to talk today about pile driving noise in relation to potential effects to species that we deal with that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And talk a little bit about why we started doing this probably 4 years ago and how we do the analysis. So it's been recognized for a long time that fish and other aquatic organisms, including sea turtles, use sound to figure out their environment. And everybody understands this in a terrestrial context because we all use sound. You know, if there's an ambulance coming down the line, you hear that siren and you know what it is. And so aquatic animals also use sound to try to figure their world out, and they use it for things like just general communication between each other, and there's a lot of fish that actually have mating calls, and so fish use that to find potential mates and form spawning groups. Some fish and other organisms use sound to detect prey or to detect predators. And then there's other things like marine mammals that will use sound and echolocation to navigate through the water. And so all these organisms have a certain range of frequencies in terms of the sound that they can produce and also in terms of the sound that they can hear. And a lot of those frequency ranges overlap with the frequency ranges that are produced by man-made activities in the water, and that can include things like pile driving, sonar, seismic surveys for oil and gas exploration, and things like that. And so when they overlap, it can be a problem. If the frequency range of the hearing range of something doesn't overlap with the activity, then it's not as much of a problem really, because the ears don't detect it and they're less likely to be damaged. But there can still be other physical effects to fish from sound if it's loud enough and in a particular frequency range. And so there has been some research done on sound and aquatic organisms. Really, a lot of that up to this point, or say up to the last 10 years, really was more ecological type things in terms of how animals communicate with each other, and not so much in terms of how man-made sound affects them. But that's sort of been an up-and-coming topic in probably last 10 to 15 years. And basically that started on the West Coast, for NMFS anyways, because they had some concerns about pile driving projects that they were afraid was going to cause injury or hearing loss to salmon that were listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, we had somebody come over from the West Coast on a detail, and they were fairly high up on the food chain, and so they decided that we probably really ought to start looking at pile driving noise. And so that was sort of the reason that we started doing it here in the southeast region. So, you know, what's the potential problems when you have pile driving noise in terms of what effect it can have on aquatic life in general, but for us particularly on species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act? And so there can be a number of different effects. You can have, if an animal is close enough to pile driving and the pile is big enough and you're doing impact driving particularly, you can actually cause physical injury to the animal. And that is usually in animals, fishes that have swim bladders, or in the case of sea turtles, the lungs, because those are air-filled organs. And so what happens is, when that sound wave comes off of the pile and goes through the water, most of the fish or the sea turtle is sort of the same density as seawater, and it's mostly made out of water. And so the sound wave passes through that, and it's not really too much of a problem. But when it hits something that's air-filled, that has a different density. And so basically that can cause that organ, the lung, or the swim bladder start vibrating, start oscillating. And if it's a severe enough oscillation, sometimes the organ will rupture, but even if it's just vibrating, you can imagine, probably not a good idea to have one of your organs vibrating inside your body, because it's going to, you may get some bleeding, broken blood vessels, hematomas for the organ itself, but it's also that sort of rubbing against the other organs can cause damage as well. The other issue is that loud sounds, just like they can on the land, can cause either temporary or permanent hearing loss. So that's why your yard guy puts on those headphones, because he's got that blower or lawnmower going all day, and that chronic exposure will eventually mess up his hearing. Same thing for rock musicians, like the guy from AC/DC. His ears are shot from listening to all that guitar for all those years. So that's another concern, because, of course, if you can't hear, you're not going to maybe pick up on a predator coming up on you, or you may have trouble locating prey or locating a mate. The other thing sound can do is that it can just be, although it may not cause physical injury if it's not that loud, it may cause a disruption of behavior. And so if something gets chased out of the area that it's in, and it has a particular need that it has to be there to spawn, to feed there, because that's the only place where a particular food source is, or anything like that, that's a problem. The other thing is, it can cause, if it's a chronic noise source and it goes on long enough, it can cause stress, and we all know stress is not a good thing. So that's another problem. It can raise cortisol levels, which can have physiological effects on the fish or the sea turtle as well. And the other thing is, and this is more related to sort of a chronic noise, we've got something called masking, where because of the frequency ranges of a human activity and the fish's hearing overlap, it may interfere with the fish being able to pick up on certain sound signals that it needs. So this is from a study that was done about 4 years ago, where they took 3 different species of fish and they developed this gizmo in the lab that could basically mimic pile driving noise and expose these 3 species of fish to the pile driving noise to determine what kind of damage they would incur if they did a certain set of pile strikes at a certain noise level and for a certain duration. So the 3 pictures here are, this is of a lake sturgeon, and one of the problems we have with researching all this sound stuff is that, of course, if it's an endangered species, you can't go beat it to death with sound. So you have to usually find some kind of species that's related and do the research with that. So there's a lake sturgeon, and the top photo is the fish that's a control fish, so it was not exposed to any pile driving noise in the lab. The other 2 photos, the fish were exposed to 186 decibels of single strike sound exposure level for what would be equivalent to 960 pile strike. So the middle picture there, you can see that the top picture, that's got that sort of egg-shaped, creamy colored thing, that's the sound bladder, or part of the swim bladder. In the middle picture, you can see that the swim bladder has some bleeding on it, and it's also partially deflated. And the picture below that, the swim bladder did not rupture or deflate, but if you look at the top, you can see that there's some bleeding at some of the organs up there, and those are the kidneys up in that thing. Now, in this particular study, when they did this to these fish, the fish did not die immediately, so these fish were actually sacrificed before they died, but you can see that they do have some injuries, and there are some types of piles and pile driving methods that can produce sounds that are much louder than 186 decibel SSEL, and so that's the reason that we have concerns about some of these pile driving projects, and we're just trying to look at them and make sure that we're satisfied that there's relatively low chance of causing problems to the listed species. So the fish in that last slide had a swim bladder. There are some fish that don't have swim bladders. Those are usually things that live right on the bottom, and also the things in the shark and ray family. So one of the fish that they tested in this study is called a hog choker, which is a very small flatfish. And when they did the same thing in terms of the sound exposure to the flatfish, they did not find any internal injuries like that. But even fish that don't have swim bladders can still incur hearing damage, because the noise in terms of hearing damage doesn't matter whether it's got a swim bladder or not. It can still lose its hearing temporarily or permanently. Okay, so one of the other things I talked about was the masking issue, and they also call that the cocktail party effect. So that's basically, if you go into a bar and it's before 5 o'clock and there's only a few people in there, you can sit next to somebody and have a conversation with them at a relatively normal level of voice. But all of a sudden everybody comes in and it's happy hour, and all of a sudden there's 100 people in there all talking at the same time, and suddenly you basically have to shout at the person who's sitting next to you because they can't hear you anymore. So with a lot of things, and particularly things that are chronic, like shipping noise, where there's a shipping lane that comes into a port, that can be a problem because there's just this constant rumble. Pile driving is probably not as much of a problem, although it depends on, the size of the project. So they're going to replace a Pensacola bridge up in the Panhandle, and that's going to take several thousand piles, and it's going to take about 3 years to do. So there's going to be pretty constant pile driving going on for 3 years. And so that's a Gulf sturgeon critical habitat area. So it can be a problem in situations like that, even if you have pile driving, because you can be disturbing the migratory route that they're taking up the river to try to get upriver and spawn. And if you disrupt that's creating a real problem for a protected species that's we're trying to get reestablished to a better population level. Now this slide basically just sort of reinforces what I said before. In the upper part of the slide is the frequency ranges that different species that are listed under the ESA in here. So you have the top one that's a type of whale. Then you have sturgeon, sawfish, sea turtles, and a sperm whale in particular. And then at the bottom, below the scale there, you can see that that's the range that a lot of different human activities that put noise in the water, the frequency range that they operate, and you can see that those do overlap with the species that you're worrying about. Okay, so that's sort of why we do this. Now I'm going to get into a little bit of how we do it. We use 4 different metrics when we're doing the analysis for these pile driver projects. The one at the top is peak pressure. So when you have a pile driving strike, there's a certain impulse, and it's got positive overpressure spikes, and it's got also underpressure spikes. And so the overpressure spikes basically kind of squeeze on the fish, and then there's a sort of equal and opposite reaction where there's actually a release of pressure that goes below the ambient level. And so that's the reason that you get an oscillation in an organ, because of that up and down, that overpressure and underpressure. But within a pulse, the peak pressure is the loudest sound at any particular instant in time. And I'll show you this on a graph in a second. And so that's one of the metrics that we look at to look at sort of instantaneous injury to a fish. The other one we have is called the single strike sound exposure level. And so that takes the whole pulse from a single strike and basically averages out the energy in it rather than having up and down spikes. And so, well, what if this was all one sound level rather than going up and down? How much energy would that impulse contain? And then the other thing that we have to look at is, because the first 2 are just sort of instant injury, the other issue is because nobody hits the pile just once, they hit it multiple times, sometimes thousands of times, and that sound energy from all those strikes accumulates, and that can also cause injury if the fish sits close enough to the pile driving operations for a long enough period of time. And so the injury there is not instantaneous, but it's more of a chronic thing, sort of like I said, your yard man being exposed to noise or noise in noisy factories or things like that, where that accumulated energy can cause damage to your hearing and things like that. And the fourth one, the root mean square metric we use in terms of looking at behavioral disruption. And that is another sort of taking a sound impulse and creating an average sound energy in the impulse. And we use that to determine whether we think there'll be behavioral disturbance of a sea turtle or a fish. So this is a graph that just shows an impulse from a single pile driving strike. And so you can see, like I said, there's positive peaks and there's negative peaks of different amplitude. And so the peak in this one is that where it's pointing to the peak spike there, that's the loudest spike at any instant in time within that pulse. And that can be a problem, like I said, because that's an instant injury. And so when we ask people to do things like dry firing or ramping up of the pile hammer, where it starts at a lower level and comes up gradually to the full force strike, that's so that the animal will be able to determine that there's a noise and it's getting louder and maybe I better get out of here. Whereas if you just hit that pile as hard as you want to right off the bat, if the fish happens to be close enough or the sea turtle, it's going to be injured, and that's a done deal at that point. You can't take that back. So those ramp up and dry firing procedures are things that we do just to try to give the animal a heads up and so it can get out of harm's way before there's any injury. And a similar thing with a single strike. With a single strike, what you're doing is you are taking most of the energy, not the whole pulse, just usually about 90–95% of the energy, and figuring out what the average energy is in the pulse. And what you have to do is do a procedure they call root mean square, because if you just take an average of this, the positive and negative peaks are going to just kind of cancel each other out, and you end up with an average that's about 0, which doesn't really tell you anything. So what we end up doing is taking the amplitudes of all these peaks and squaring them, so that way if you square a positive number, you get a positive number, but if you square a negative number, you also get a positive number. So you take all those squares, you take an average of those, but then you have the average of the squares, so if you take square root of that, that's what the root mean square is, and that gives you sort of the average energy. And this is a root mean square that we use for behavior. In this case, we use the whole impulse and take the average of that, but it's the same idea where the root mean square is mathematically the same for either one. It's just how much of the pulse you use. So some criteria were developed in terms of how loud a sound could potentially cause injury. And these were developed on the West Coast, and we've basically adopted what was agreed upon a number of years ago between the DOTs out on the West Coast and Federal Highways and Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service. And so the injury thresholds are the same for fish and turtles. The peak pressure, if you have a sound that's 206 decibels, peak pressure or above that, an animal that's close enough to be bombarded with a sound like that can be injured or get hearing loss. And for the single strike sound exposure level, the threshold is 187 decibels. And then when you go to the cumulative sound exposure level, where you're taking into account not only how much energy is in a single pulse, but how many pulses are they going to be exposed to in a day, that threshold is also 187 decibels. For behavior, we actually split it between fish and sea turtles because it's thought that sea turtles are a little less susceptible to behavioral disruption. They're not quite as hearing-oriented as some of the other aquatic organisms are. So the fish have a threshold of 150 decibels where they could be behaviorally disturbed if it's above that. Sea turtles, however, it's 160 decibels because they're not thought to be quite as susceptible to disruption of behaviors from noise. And so that's for impact driving. For vibratory driving, the thresholds are the same for the most part. The only one that's really different is the cumulative sound exposure level. That's considerably higher. It was 187 for impact driving, but it's 234 decibels for vibratory driving. And so, you know, when I first found out about this, I was kind of curious as to why it would be different between impact and vibratory driving. But it's basically a matter of the sound signals that come off of an impact pile driving situation are different than qualitatively than the signal that comes off of vibratory driving. So impact driving is more like a nail gun or something like that, where it's got a very focused frequency range, and it tends to also usually be higher noise level, as opposed to vibratory driving, which is really has a very wide frequency range. It's more like a white noise situation. It's usually not as loud either, so it may be very annoying to the animal, but it's less likely that it's going to create injury, at least instantly. And they found in the lab that animals seem to be able to take a lot more vibratory noise in terms of accumulated exposure than they are impact noise. Okay, so when we do an analysis, the information that we ask for from whoever's asking for the consultation, whether it's FDOT as a representative of Federal Highways or the Corps or the Coast Guard, we need a certain set of information. And so the thing that we need primarily is we need to know what kind of piles are we talking about. You know, what are they made out of and what size are they? And also the other thing we need to know is in a single day how many, and I'll talk about impact driving right now, how many hammer strikes are going to occur for over the whole day, depending, and that depends of course on how many piles you do. And sometimes we get the information as, oh, it's going to be 5 piles a day and 1,000 strikes per pile is our estimate. So that's 5,000 strikes for the whole day. Other times people just tell us the total number and they don't break it down like that. But either way, we just need the total number of strikes. And so when we have the information about the pile type and the number of strikes, we can go into a document by Caltrans, which came out a number of years ago, and it's got a compendium in the back that has tables that list for different pile types what noise levels have been measured. And so we go in there, we can find the pile type that we want, and it will give us data on the peak pressure level, the single strike sound exposure level, and the root mean square level. And we can take that information along with the number of hammer strikes, or in the case of vibratory, what we use is the number of seconds of vibratory that are going to occur over the course of a day, and we can do the analysis. And so the other metric is the cumulative sound exposure level, and so I'll just talk a little bit about how we calculate that. That is basically based on the single strike sound exposure level that we look up in the table from Caltrans, and then it takes the 10 log, it adds to that sound exposure level 10 log of the number of pile strikes that will occur in a single day. And so obviously the more pile strikes that you have, the larger the cumulative sound exposure level is going to be, and the further away an animal is going to have to be from the pile driving source so that it is not injured. The other thing you have to do is you have to pick a model, and the transmission loss constant is related to the model that tells you as you move away from the pile driving source how quickly do noise levels drop off. And it's a logarithmic function, so initially sound levels drop pretty quickly. As you get further away, it's sort of diminishing return, and it doesn't drop off as quickly as you get further away. For most projects, the constant that you're going to use is going to be 15. That's for any coastal projects, and that's based on the fact that the sound is going to travel away from the source laterally, but when it tries to go vertically, it's probably going to hit the bottom, the substrate, and also hit the water-air interface and sort of either be absorbed at those interfaces or bounce back. And so 15 is the one used for coastal projects. The 20 constant is used for offshore projects, but you'd have to be in very deep water where the sound could just sort of go in all directions, sort of like an expanding ball. For most DOT projects, unless it's something very unusual, we'd be using the 15 as a constant. Okay, so this is just an example of how these things get calculated. So this is for, say, we have a concrete square piles, 24 inches on a side. We look up that in the Caltrans compendium, and we get these numbers for peak pressure, single strike SEL, and root mean square. And DOT or the contractor says, well, it's going to be a total of 2,000 pile strikes a day. So we have a spreadsheet that we go into, and basically where the green areas are, that's where the data gets put in, and those blue areas are the output. I don't know how easy that is to see. I thought it would come out a little better. But the blue areas are the outputs of the zones for injury and for behavioral disturbance. So up at the top there, you can see that there's numbers for peak pressure, for root mean square, and for single strike SEL. The other thing that you have to be careful of when you look these things up is to make sure you know what distance the measurements were taken at, because that has an effect on the output. So in most things in the Caltrans document, those measurements were pretty much all made at 10 meters. But occasionally you come up with something else where somebody's back calculated it to right at the source, and so then you don't have to put 1 meter in because it's right at the source. So you just have to be a little careful of that. Below that, you see you put in the estimated number of strikes, and once you put that number in, it will spit out this output here. And so in this case, there was no peak pressure injury. The single strike sound exposure level, you have to calculate a little differently. The spreadsheet doesn't really do that for you. There's another spreadsheet you have to use for that. But you can see the cumulative injury zone extends out 83 feet from the source. And then for sea turtles and fish, you see the RMS levels there of 160 and 150. So sea turtles could have behavioral disturbance if they were within 152 feet of pile driving, and fish could be behaviorally disturbed within 707 feet. So when you read our letters, all that stuff is laid out, but that's how we calculate it. To do a single strike injury, you have to figure out is the single strike level at the source more than 187. If it is, then you just subtract that 187 from what the number at the source is, figure out how many decibels the noise has to drop before they're outside of that zone, and you can manipulate this chart here on the left. You can change the range, and all the way to the right, it'll tell you how fast at that distance decibel levels, or how much decibel level drop there's going to be at the distance that you plug in for the left side. Okay, so I'll do it. I'm going to do a vibratory analysis, which is very similar, but there's a couple of little things. So this is steel sheet piles, 24 inches wide, and once again, it's from Caltrans. The numbers come from Caltrans, so the measurements are made at 10 meters, and it gives you the peak pressure, the single strike SEL, and the root mean square. And in this case, we're not looking at number of strikes. We're looking at how many seconds of vibratory are they going to do in a day. So in this example, it's 7,200 seconds. There's another spreadsheet, which is laid out pretty much like the impact spreadsheet, but it's the same idea. You put in numbers for peak, for root mean square, and for single strike SEL. You make sure that the distances that you have in there for the distance of measurement is right. And in this case, instead of number of strikes, you put in number of seconds of vibratory, and it gives you the same kind of output. But in this case, of course, there's no peak pressure injury. You'd have to go figure out the single strike SEL, but that turns out that there's no injury from that either. And in this case, there's no cumulative injury as well, and that's probably because the vibratory threshold is so much higher than the impact threshold. So most times vibratory, if you get any kind of injury zone, it's usually very small. You're much more likely to run into that problem with impact driving. And the same thing with the behavioral disturbance. sea turtles have to be more than 33 feet away to not experience behavioral disturbance, and the fish have to be more than 152 feet away. So that's basically, in a nutshell, why we do the noise analyses now and how we do them. And so I would be happy to take any questions, or Brandon, if it's something that's particularly germane to the east coast of Florida or the species over there he deals with. And I guess I'll take questions.
This is Pete Southall. I have a question for you, David.
Okay.
And this is, so if we're not going to use driving as a method to put the pile in, are there any concerns about drilled shaft? What sort of things might endanger these species if we were using that method?
Well, I have actually been coming across drilled shafts a little more in the last year. I've had to help a couple of people with some DOT projects that were not Florida DOT, but they were using drilled shafts. I think I actually have had a couple other minor projects that I help people with where they're using drilled shafts. Drilled shafts are less of a problem, I would say. They're probably more in line with vibratory driving because it's more of that sort of chronic grinding noise, white noise issue rather than having a sharp pulsed peak like you get with impact driving. So drill shafts don't seem to be too much of a problem, unless you were maybe like in a river and it was a migratory pathway for something and there maybe could be behavioral disturbance. But generally, I don't think you're going to run into any problems with actual injury from drill shafts, at least in terms of what I have had to deal with so far and seen.
So I guess I'd like to follow up with another question that, with manatees, we're concerned about entanglement in things like turbidity barriers and anything like that in the water. Do we know, do we have instances of sturgeon turtles, being caught in turbidity barriers, or do they not tend to get wrapped up in those things?
Well, I think it's possible. I don't know that I've heard any reports of that. I would think that mostly not in terms of the barriers itself. If there's lines coming off of the barriers where it's been tied off, they think you get tangled up in lines sometimes. But, you can probably minimize that by keeping the line as short as possible and not have a lot of trailing line hanging out in the water. But I don't know that we've really had any issues with that. But, of course, you guys have to check the turbidity barriers periodically anyways because of the manatee issue. So, for the most part, I don't think we really get too much into that in the consultations just because we haven't seen it be much of a problem in terms of construction projects anyways.
I haven't seen that either on this coast, Dave. But
yeah.
This is David. I was wondering, how does the substrate affect the numbers that you're seeing? I know that some of these numbers are from the West Coast where it's rocky and different than our coast with the sand. And so, has there been any analysis of how the substrate affects the noise?
Well, I had a concern about that when we first started doing this stuff. And so there have been a limited number of measurements made in Florida. When they were doing test pile driving for the US 331 bridge up in Choctawhatchee Bay, that's a Gulf Sturgeon migratory pathway. I had them come in and do some measurements on that. And honestly, the measurements I think there's probably situations where if you were going into solid rock, you would get a different sound level than if you were going into just sort of mud and sand and clay and things like that. But so far, the numbers that I've seen from what has been measured in Florida for the same kind of pile don't seem to be very different from what was in the Caltrans document for the West Coast.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Dave, this is Tu. I have a question about best management practices. I know during your presentation you talked about ramping up the pile driving activity. What are some other things that have proven to be successful that we could potentially consider for our projects here in Florida?
Yeah, I mean, there's noise attenuation techniques. People tend not to want to do them because it's just another thing they got to do. They're not crazy about that. It just makes an operation a little more complicated. They have used things like bubble curtains, which is basically just a ring that sits on the bottom where you're going to be driving the pile around the pile, and it spits out a lot of bubbles. Well, what the bubbles do is that different density of the air bubbles sort of helps break up the sound wave that comes off of the pile driving. And depending on how effectively it's done, it can knock down decibel levels by 10 or 11 decibels in some cases. There's other things you can do, like put a coffer dam around the area you're pile driving and dewater it. Sometimes that can be an issue because then you got to put the coffer dam in, and there may be noise associated with that. But they do have some coffer dams, I guess, that are sort of like inflatable coffer dams almost. So that's another thing. Well, basically the idea is if you can put something around the pile that either has air bubbles that come up or that can be dewatered, so there's an airspace between the pile that's being driven and the water, that will help diminish sound levels as well. I know in California they've one of the universities there in the physics department, I think, they're working on a type of pile which is sort of has a self-contained isolation casing that's actually linked into the pile. Now, they use mostly more pipe piles out there. They don't seem to use pipe piles a lot in Florida. But that apparently is very effective, and it's knocked down decibel levels by as much as 20 decibels, which really makes a big difference in how much noise is going to go into the water. I did talk to them a little bit about could that be adapted to concrete piles, and they seemed to think that was a possibility, but they thought I had a lot of money, so they were kind of out of luck there to help them with that. But I mean, I don't know if the federal highways or any of the DOTs are interested in talking to those folks, because that seems like, and apparently because it's all sort of put together before they start pile driving, it's not really that much harder to do the pile driving that way than it would be to do regular standard pile driving. But those are sort of the main best management practices at this point. There's also other things, some like seasonal restrictions, which everybody has run into, I'm sure, at some point, where if there's a spawning season or a season when the fish are migrating, you just don't pile drive for those few months. And that helps to diminish any potential adverse impacts as well.
Thank you. Anyone else have any more questions?
Hi, Tu. Yeah, this is Tiffany in the Turnpike. I was just wondering if we have a project that's being done or designed as a design build and we don't have the specifics on maybe all that information that you need to do your analysis about how many times, how many strikes and the types of piles and maybe that kind of thing, how is that addressed through you guys?
Well, that's been a problem. There's one or two ways to do it. You can either wait until you do have that information, or alternatively, if you can come up with a worst case scenario, saying, well, this is the biggest pile we're going to use, and so based on that, say, well, that's sort of worst case scenario, and this is probably the maximum number of strikes we would have to use. We can look at it that way. If we end up using information for a smaller pile and it turns out to be a bigger pile, or they got to do a lot more strikes, then you got to reinitiate, and you don't really gain much. We just end up having to do the same thing twice. We're not crazy about doing that. I've done it before. People have some level of certainty. It doesn't have to be absolute, but they have some idea of how this thing is going to be built. We can go with that and go the worst case scenario route, or you can just tell us what you think it's going to be. That's sort of what I'm doing with Pinellas Bayway Structure E right now. We're basing it on what was done for Structure C bridge, and hopefully they're similar enough that I don't have to go back and do the consultation again, you know. But if they come back and go, well, we're not using 24-inch piles now, we're using 50-inch piles, well, then I would have to redo it, because that's sort of apples and oranges at that point. I got to redo the analysis. So that's sort of the only option that there are. We would prefer to have the information, but I know sometimes that's always an issue. There's always a level of uncertainty with some of these projects in terms, not just the pile driving noise, but in other things where they come to us and they go, well, you know, we don't really know at this point, but it's hard for us to do an analysis if we don't have the data we need. So it's a difficult situation, but we do what we can.
This is Ann Broadwell from District 4, and I think we need to start having the discussion about next steps in order to make this review process with National Marine Fisheries be as efficient as possible. It just seems that getting through this ESA consultation gets really bogged down. So, you know, is there information that we should be providing your agency in order to speed this stuff up, or?
Yeah, I mean, we are very aware, because we talk to congressmen all the time. We're very aware this is a problem, not just for FDOT projects, but a lot of things in the southeast region. They are actually trying to work on some new ways of doing things to get. The problem is that about 3 or 4 years ago, we started getting a lot more consultation requests for projects that the Corps was dealing with that normally they would not have asked for consultations for in the past. And so we just got way behind on consultations, and the review process that they had been using at that point was very involved. And, you know, several people had to look at it, including our lawyers, and it's just one of those things where it was so intense a review process that it was taking a long time, and we just kept getting further and further behind, so more and more consultations were coming in. They are aware of that, so they're working on some ways of dealing with sort of the smaller consultations, so that they just get sort of, if we have enough information, they get signed off on quick, and there's not as big a review process, so that way we can focus on the things that really need to get reviewed. Believe it or not, FDOT projects do actually get priority, and they move through the system quicker, so I know that's hard for you to believe, but
yeah, I'll tell you, it doesn't feel like we're getting priority.
So I think
is there anyone that maybe Katasha or or Kathleen Toulin, some of our central office folks, need to reach out to make sure that, you know, Congress continues to hear the message, or that, you know, folks in Washington, D.C., National Marine Fisheries Service, you know, understands the time issue that we encounter with these consultations? I mean, do we need to do a programmatic agreement? I just want to...
Well, they are doing that. That's one of the things that they have been doing. Mostly that's been for not necessarily DOT projects, but for a lot of the things that sort of clog up the pipeline, like people's single-family docks and seawalls and minor dredging projects and things like that. And that's really the bulk of the consultations that we've been dealing with, and that's sort of what's really clogged the whole system up. So they are, you know, they are working on, they have done some programmatics for things like that, and some of the things in the programmatic even cover minor FDOT things like scour countermeasures, you know, the concrete mats they use for scour countermeasures and things like that. But they are very aware that this is, I mean, they're very aware. We have meetings like every week to talk about ways to try to streamline things and get things through quicker. So, I mean, I can give you the name of somebody to talk to. But I mean, I will tell you, they are very, very aware, all the way from the top of the food chain all the way down to the consultation biologist, that this is a problem, and it's got to be fixed, like sooner rather than later. But I can give you a name of somebody if you want to talk to somebody in our office. I'd be happy to let you know who.
Well, you know, it just seems like we now, I think, state of Florida, Katasha, we have what, 3 hydroacoustic studies of readings that were taken during construction in several different locations throughout Florida. Is there a way of packaging that information so that we can, if you can demonstrate that your project falls within the limits of these field surveys, that we'd be able to just breeze through this? I mean, we're looking for anything.
I mean, they could do programmatic.
We have a lot of really cool projects, really good projects throughout the districts.
Right.
That, you know, a lot of our design PMs are like, oh, I don't want to do that because I don't want to have to deal with National Marine Fisheries. And these are, you know, fishing piers and modifying existing structures to make them more multimodal friendly, pedestrian bridges, bicyclist bridges, things like that. Things that are really good projects, but, you know, when you know that you got to go through this whole hydroacoustic exercise, nobody wants to do them, and it's unfortunate because they are good projects.
Yeah, now I think in the case of the project that you're talking about there, it's probably possible we could do it programmatic. You know, there would probably be some constraints on the maximum pile size you'd be talking about, and you'd have to commit to doing some best management practices, like ramping up or dry firing and things like that. But I mean, I think that it's possible that you could probably cover a pretty significant range of projects with a programmatic. Now, you're always going to have, you know, if you're talking about like very large bridge projects like Howard Franklin Bridge, I-275 replacement, or the Pensacola Bay Bridge, those would still probably have to be done as individual consultations because they're more involved. But I think that, yeah, you could probably do a programmatic for the hydroacoustic part of a lot of the projects that you're talking about. Like I said, you just have to put a constraint on pile size and things like that. But if you can fit, you know, a large number of projects under those constraints, yeah, that would speed things up considerably. Now, the thing about the fishing pier that I will tell you is the fishing piers are really not a problem in terms of the pile driving. The issue we run into the fishing piers is once the fishing pier is built and people start using it, there's a potential that they can accidentally hook sea turtles. That's usually the main issue when you're adding a fishing pier, and it's really not so much the pile driving. You know, the pile driving part we could probably put a programmatic, and that would be fine. But you really have to kind of take a hard look at the use of the fishing pier and the potential for incidental capture of listed species. And that can vary from, you know, geographic location to location, and depends on whether it's in the estuary, it's on the coast, or, you know, there's other factors in there. But I mean, it's possible that maybe that could be rolled into the programmatic. You would just have to sort of have an overarching view of potential fishing piers that are going to be built in, say, the next 5 years, and do that analysis that way. But I mean,
I'm talking about like some of our in-kind bridge replacements too, where they're fixed structures. We're not building bascule piers that are going to have to support a moving bascule bridge like over the intercoastal waterway for navigation purposes. But we have a lot of little off-system bridges here in Fort Lauderdale that are in tidally influenced waters, and they should go quick, but not so much.
Well, I mean, like I said, if there was a programmatic, they would go very quick. But we would have to do the programmatic, and I can go talk to protected resources folks and see if that's a possibility to do programmatic. then we just have to sit down and sort of hash out the details of, you know, what's the biggest pile size you're talking about, and what techniques you're going to use to install them, and what best management practices would we maybe require. But I think that's a real possibility for projects like that. Yeah. So I can go back and talk to some of the folks at Protected Resources and see if we can maybe start thinking about that and get it going.
Okay,
That's
and
sort of what
it's not
they
that I
want
want
to
to
do.
yeah, it's not that I want to put a lot of work on National Marine Fisheries Service, because, you know, DOT's got resources to be able to, you know, at least crank out some of these draft documents for others to review and comment on. So it would definitely be a joint effort.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But I think that's a real possibility. That's sort of what, in situations where they can do programmatic, that's where we're moving towards that, because that way you sort of look at the overarching view of whatever that activity is, and you really actually get a better analysis that way, and it just sort of eliminates this whole doing individual consultations and having to go through this whole review process. So once you get it done, things go a lot quicker. It's just a matter of going through the effort to get the programmatic up and running.
Hey, Brandon, do you have anything to offer?
I think Dave did a pretty good job. I was going to talk about, you know, the challenge. I was going to respond the same way he did with we have the statewide programmatic biological opinion now that covers a lot of the activities DOT does outside of pile driving. There may be possibilities to do a programmatic consultation. I believe that when the last one, the statewide one, was done for the Corps, that someone at the Corps tried to put some pile driving stuff in there, and it got taken out. So you know, Dave can better gauge what PR's response would be to the initiation of a programmatic consultation request, and getting that issued, since he is there in St. Pete and works closely with PR even more than I do. So yeah, I think Dave kind of covered most of the things and answered in the same ways that I would have.
Well, in terms of coordination, when you're looking at a canal and stuff, and you're doing coordination under ESA, in the past, if there wasn't any mangroves in that area, we had said no effect. And I know the Corps has then asked for us to then still initiate with you on small tooth sawfish. Do you think that's going to change, or are we always going to just assume effect?
I can say that, you know, those sorts of calls. So you got to remember in ESA that there's the lead federal action agency, or their designee. DOT is designated as FHWA's non-federal representative, and you can consult on things that aren't formal consultations that require biological opinions. So if there's a way to work with the Corps directly between Federal Highway and or DOT to get them to accept your call as a lead federal action agency on whether or not a project will affect listed species, then that's an avenue right there that you can make the effect determination yourself and get the Corps to adopt it. They've been resistant to that, but the short answer, though, is that no, as long as the Corps initiates consultation, then we react. So they're the ones who make the call on all these projects to initiate, whether there's mangrove, seagrass, and bottom, whatever is present. So that's the difference, and that's kind of how, you know, Section 7 works.
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to think if there's some way to get the Corps to accept those determinations, but I know it's been a challenge in the past. Maybe there's some kind of joint discussion we could have with them on that.
Yeah.
David?
Yeah.
This is Ken Huntington. We do a lot of these noise analysis for DOT, and they routinely use 24-inch piles or less, and we routinely demonstrate that the impact from noise is below the thresholds, and we always have scenarios in which there is unlimited escape routes to go out to the Atlantic Ocean or down into a lagoon or a bay. And so it just seems like an excessive amount of time to have to wait 9 months to get an agreement that there is, may affect, not likely to adversely affect. I think that's one of the main frustrations that Ann Broadwell just expressed.
Yeah, and I understand that. I wish it went faster too. It's so fun for me to have people call me up all the time and go, well, where is it now? Like, I wish it went faster. I wish that I think the review process is probably a little too much for most of these smaller bridge projects. Unfortunately, nobody has made me king yet, so I don't get to change the rules. But like I said, they're aware that they can't keep going like this. They're getting a lot of pressure from a lot of different directions that they have to make this happen faster. And like I said, if we could do a programmatic for the type of projects you're talking about, that once that programmatic's in place, everything would go much, much faster. But first you got to do the programmatic, which is certainly something that's doable. It's just a matter of actually doing it and getting it in place and getting it signed off on, and then things would speed up for those types of projects considerably.
I got one thing to add to that is, pile driving isn't always the only concern. So I know the pile driving analysis requires a lot of input on the applicant side, but there's also other effects of species. If you're impacting seagrass, if you're impacting corals, if you're impacting sponge communities, if you're transport of materials to and from the work site, whether you're dewatering. So there's a lot of effects that are analyzed in the ESA consultation process besides pile driving. So even if you took pile driving off the table, there may be other reasons that you could have effects to listed species.
Okay, I have a question. I'm looking at the marine fishery calculation table. This is for the pile driving.
Right.
And it shows that in this case, for this example, that there is a injury. I guess what I'm trying to find out, the practical thinking in construction, how what we're seeing in the biological opinion is going to affect construction. And I just see where this is the US 331 biological opinion, and it looks like that there has been some determination of decibel decrease based on the types of best management practices that have been used in the field, like bubble curtains will do a certain number of decimals.
Right.
I know we talked about a compendium for the information going in on the front. Is there something on the back that we can tell construction? If you do A, B, and C, we can reduce.
Yeah, usually, we haven't done a whole lot of projects where they've had to do noise abatement. So usually if they will do some kind of a noise abatement, and that in general is going to be bubble curtains or what I call isolation casing. Some people call them temporary noise attenuation piles, but it's basically just a big tube that goes around the pile that gets dewater or has bubbles blown up through it. And usually in that case we'll do the analysis based on an 11 decibel reduction in noise.
So then working back from the Excel spreadsheet that we're going to use on the permitting side, using all of the output, we're going to come up with a action area for both injury and behavioral effects.
Right.
And then from that point, work with construction on how to reduce the amount of noise within those areas.
Yeah, and it depends on the situation. If the zone is not terribly large, they almost always agree to do the sawfish and sea turtle conditions where they're supposed to monitor 50 feet out. And so in that case, if you can, do the ramp up, just move the animals out somewhat from the operations. And I imagine that sea turtles and most fish don't hang around a construction site like most wildlife. They go someplace else because we don't want all the human commotion and the noise and all that stuff. So yeah, it depends on how loud the pile driving is going to be. as to what we asked for. But yeah, I mean, but basically, you know what the injury zones are, and you work from there to figure out what the issues are and what may be required.
Okay. And then once you have your action area and you have your noise attenuation method in place, you're still looking for monitoring during construction to make sure there's no exceed, or?
Well, I mean, we haven't really asked for monitoring a whole lot. That's usually on something that's a big project, like Pensacola Bay Bridge. They're talking about maybe using 60-inch concrete piles. That's a pretty big pile. It makes a lot of noise. I mean, it hasn't really been designed. They don't know they're going to use that for sure, but that's sort of what they're proposing conceptually. So, you know, that would be a big issue. If you just use a 24-inch pile, it's usually not that big a deal.
And then speaking of big bridge projects, say that they have multiple operations of pile driving going. You know, maybe they're going to work from both ends and go in. In our assessment during permitting, we're going to look at each, I guess, the effects of each one, and probably they'll be very similar, you know.
Yeah.
But then maybe if we have two that are closer and the action areas maybe combined.
Well, I mean, yeah, initially you're going to have each operation is going to have its own radius around it where there's potential for effects. So it depends on how they're spaced and how they're going to move. I mean, I ran into that when I was doing the US 331 Choctawhatchee Bay Bridge, because that's a spawning migration pathway, and so we had to kind of figure out how they were going to stagger their pile driving operations, and, you know, were they moving coming from the outside and moving in, or they starting in the middle and then going back out, and how those sort of circles moved, and was there still pathways that the fish could get through there without getting whacked. So yeah, if there's multiple operations, we have to take that into consideration, but that's usually for bigger projects. So.
Well, we know on the Howard Franklin Bridge, we're thinking 4 operations at the same time,
right,
which is pretty big.
Yeah.
So that scenario will probably play out, where we have 2 action areas overlapping.
Right. So then it's just a matter of, do animals have a pathway they can get through, or can they escape the area? I mean, at least you're not in Gulf sturgeon critical habitat. So that's really just that's mostly sea turtles you got to worry about there. So, you know.
So in that scenario, we have 2 work groups that are like coming close to each other. For the calculation, it would just be like cumulative number of strikes for both operations for that action area.
I mean, if they're right next to each other, yeah, because it's sort of almost, at some point it's almost like one big pile driving thing rather than 2 separate. Mm-hmm.
All right, any more questions? Very good discussion. Thank you, David, for the presentation. I think it's very helpful. Thank you, Brandon, as well, for chiming in. I think it gives all of DOT and the district folks just things to think about, what is required, what we should provide to you to expedite as much as possible your review in consulting for our project. So really appreciate your time and looking forward to continue to working with you as we kind of go through this and figure out how to expedite some of our reviews.
Thank you, David.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Our next permit coordinators meeting is April the 13th, and we'll be back to our regular scheduled agenda items. So appreciate everyone calling in today, and hopefully we can get this recording posted and shared with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.